April 17, 2021. St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The world watched a solitary Queen Elizabeth II say goodbye to the man who had been her strength and stay for 73 years. Because of global health restrictions, the guest list was clinical, truncated to just 30 mourners. But among the sea of familiar British faces stood three men who felt like glitches in the royal matrix: Prince Donatus of Hesse, Prince Philip of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, and Bernhard, hereditary Prince of Baden. To the casual observer, they were German relatives. To the historian, they were the return of the repressed. They were the grandsons of the women the British monarchy spent 7 decades trying to delete from the narrative. These were the descendants of Prince Philip's 4 sisters, women who were banned, silenced, and scrubbed from his 1947 wedding because they hadn't just married Germans. They had married the Third Reich. This is not a fairy tale. This is a study in systemic survival and the brutal cost of royal erasure. To understand why Philip's sisters were erased, you have to understand the collapse of the world they were born into. Philip was not born into the manicured silence of Buckingham Palace. He was born on June 10, 1921, on a kitchen table in Corfu, Greece. By 1922, the family's reality underwent a violent snap. Following a military coup, Philip's father, Prince Andrew of Greece, was sentenced to death, later commuted to exile. The family fled in the middle of the night on a British warship. Philip, an 18-month-old infant, was transported in a makeshift cot made of an orange crate. This was the first of many deletions. The family landed in Paris, living on the charity of relatives, their identity stripped of its sovereign power. In this state of geopolitical limbo, the family unit began to rot from the inside. By 1930, the psychological foundation of Philip's life dissolved. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, suffered a severe mental collapse. She claimed to be receiving divine messages. She believed she possessed healing powers. The medical response was barbaric. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, she was forcibly taken to a Swiss asylum. Under the advice of Sigmund Freud, doctors subjected her to high-dose X-rays of her ovaries to kill her libido and cure her delusions. She would be institutionalized for years, a ghost in a sanitarium. Philip's father did not stay to pick up the pieces. He moved to Monte Carlo with a mistress, essentially resigning from fatherhood to live a life of gambling and yachting. At 9 years old, Philip was effectively an orphan. His mother was locked away. His father had vanished. His 4 older sisters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie, were his only anchors. But they were young women in a collapsing Europe, and they did the only thing royal refugees could do to survive. They married into the only power structure left that would have them. They married German princes, and they did it just as the Weimar Republic was being devoured by National Socialism. By 1933, all 4 sisters were living in Germany. This is where the story enters the uncanny valley of royal history. These weren't just German aristocrats. They were positioned at the very heart of the Nazi machine. The youngest, Sophie, and the charming Führer. Sophie, Philip's youngest sister, married Prince Christoph of Hesse. Christoph was not a passive bystander. He was an SS Oberführer, senior colonel, and the head of Hermann Göring's secret intelligence service, tasked with wiretapping political rivals. Sophie's unpublished memoirs reveal a chillingly mundane domesticity alongside evil. She described hosting Adolf Hitler for lunch in her apartment, calling him a charming and seemingly modest man. A famous photograph from 1935 shows Sophie sitting directly across from Hitler at a wedding feast, smiling in the glow of the swastika. When her first son was born, she named him Karl Adolf in honor of the Führer. The favorite, Cecilia, and the 1937 nightmare. Cecilia was the sister Philip loved most. In 1937, her life ended in a sequence of events that feels like a dark cinematic trope. 8 months pregnant, she boarded a flight to London for a family wedding. The plane hit thick fog over Belgium, clipped a factory chimney, and disintegrated. Rescuers found a horrifying detail in the wreckage: the remains of a newborn infant. Cecilia had gone into labor mid-air or during the impact. The funeral in Darmstadt was Philip's first true encounter with the new Germany. At 16, he walked behind his sister's coffin through streets lined with crowds performing the Hitler salute. He was surrounded by men in full SS regalia. Those photographs are the reason the palace later chose silence. They are visual proof of a bloodline contaminated by the 20th century's greatest horror. When World War II broke out in 1939, the family was split by a literal firing line. Philip was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, hunting German U-boats in the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, his brothers-in-law were officers in the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht. When the war ended in 1945, Philip wanted to marry Princess Elizabeth, but the British public was still living in the rubble of the Blitz. The King, George VI, and his advisors faced a PR nightmare. How could the future queen marry a man whose sisters had broken bread with the architects of the Holocaust? The solution was the deletion. To become the Duke of Edinburgh, Philip had to undergo a metaphorical identity lobotomy. He renounced his Greek and Danish titles. He abandoned his family name and took his mother's anglicized name, Mountbatten, and, most brutally, his sisters were banned from the wedding. On November 20th, 1947, at Westminster Abbey, Philip walked down the aisle essentially alone. His mother was there, but the palace forced her to remove the gray nun's habit she had adopted, dressing her in a safe silk gown to avoid awkward questions. His 3 surviving sisters were forced to listen to the ceremony on the radio in Germany. In the eyes of the British state, they did not exist. While the sisters were caught in the Nazi orbit, their mother, Princess Alice, was performing a silent miracle. Living in Nazi-occupied Athens, the Mad Princess hid a Jewish family, the Cohens, in her home for over a year. When the Gestapo came to interview her, she utilized her deafness, pretending not to understand their questions, until they grew frustrated and left. This creates a staggering psychological map of the family. The son, a British war hero fighting the Nazis. The sisters, wives of SS officers and supporters of the Reich. The mother, a deaf nun risking her life to save Jews from the Gestapo. Philip lived in the center of this tension. He was the bridge between the righteous and the Reich. Philip spent the rest of his life practicing the stiff upper lip, a defensive architecture built to protect his wife's throne. When asked about his family, he would offer the same clinical summary. The family broke up. My mother was ill. My sisters were married. My father was in the south of France. I just had to get on with it. But getting on with it didn't mean forgetting. Behind the scenes, the erasure began to fail. In 1953, the sisters were quietly invited to the coronation. In the 1960s, Philip began visiting his German nephews. He was slowly reassembling the pieces of his shattered foundation in private. When Princess Alice died in 1969, she was eventually buried in Jerusalem at her own request. At the ceremony, Philip spoke of her small act of compassion in hiding the Cohens. It was one of the few times he allowed the mask of the British consort to slip and reveal the European prince. We return to April 2021. Philip's funeral was his final act of rebellion against the palace's 1947 mandate. In his last will and testament regarding his funeral arrangements, he personally requested that the descendants of his erased sisters be present. The three German princes who walked into St. George's Chapel weren't just guests, they were the completion of a circle. After 74 years of being the Hun, the Nazi adjacent, or the inconvenient, the bloodline was finally allowed back into the light. Prince Philip's life was a masterclass in narrative control. He allowed himself to be erased so that the British monarchy could survive the post-war era. He traded his family for a crown, his name for a title, and his past for a future. The royals erased his sisters because they represented the darkest chapter of the human story. But Philip's final act proved that you can bury a story, you can ban the guests, and you can change the name. But the ghost architecture of where we come from always remains. Philip didn't just get on with it, he waited, and in the very end, he brought his sisters home.